There is a version of the universe where the Infinity War never lasted more than 4 minutes, not because the Avengers were stronger, not because Doctor Strange found a better timeline, but because something showed up on that battlefield that had no business being there, something that the Infinity Stones couldn't register, couldn't measure, and couldn't stop. Something bald, something bored, something wearing rubber boots. And the moment Thanos saw it walking toward him across the ruins of Titan, he felt, for the first time in his immortal life, something he had never felt before. Not resistance, not defiance, but a single, quiet, utterly paralyzing thought: what is that? This is not the Infinity War you remember. This is the one that ended before it began. Before we go any further, if you have ever asked yourself what would actually happen if a truly limitless being walked into the MCU, not as a villain, not as a god, but just as a guy who showed up, then you need to stay right here, because what we're about to explore is not a joke video, not a meme compilation. This is a full cinematic alternate universe breakdown of every single consequence that follows the moment Saitama throws one punch in the Marvel Universe. And I promise you, the ending of this story is darker and more serious than anything you're expecting right now. Hit that like button, make sure you're subscribed, and do not skip a single second, because every part of this builds on the last, and if you miss the middle, the ending won't hit the way it's supposed to. To understand what happens when Saitama enters the Infinity War, you first have to understand what the Infinity War actually was, not as a movie, not as a comic event, but as a cosmological reality within the Marvel Universe. The Infinity War was not simply a battle. It was the culmination of an idea that had been building across the fabric of existence for thousands of years, an idea held by one man, one Titan, one being who believed with absolute and unshakable conviction that he was the only one in the universe willing to do what needed to be done. Thanos did not see himself as a destroyer. He saw himself as a doctor, holding a scalpel over a universe that was bleeding out, and every life he had ever taken, every planet he had ever halved, every atrocity he had ever committed, he filed all of it under the category of necessary medicine. And the terrible, unsettling truth about Thanos is that his logic, however monstrous, was internally consistent. He had watched his own world die. He had proposed a solution and been laughed out of the room by people who thought he was insane. And then he had stood on the ashes of Titan and felt the horrible, nauseating satisfaction of being right. That is what made him dangerous, not the Infinity Gauntlet, not the stones, not the armies he commanded across the galaxy. It was the fact that he genuinely believed, down to the molecular level of his being, that he was saving the universe, and that belief gave him a patience and a focus that made him almost impossible to stop. By the time the Infinity War begins in the timeline we're examining today, Thanos has already collected the Power Stone from Xandar, and what happened on Xandar is important because the movie never shows it to you. Xandar was not a battle, it was an extinction. The Nova Corps, an entire military and civilian population, was effectively ended in a single night, and Thanos walked away from it the way you walk away from completing a task on a to-do list. Calm, efficient, unbothered. He then intercepted the Asgardian refugee ship, carrying the survivors of Ragnarok, killed half of them because of course he did, took the space stone from Loki, crushed Thor's skull to the point of near death, and left the wreckage drifting in space as a message to anyone in the universe who thought they understood what was coming. This is the Thanos who arrives at the beginning of the Infinity War. Not a Thanos at the beginning of his journey, but a Thanos who is already most of the way to the finish line, already holding stones of immeasurable power, already having proven to himself and everyone else that the Avengers, the Guardians, the masters of the mystic arts, and every other force in the Marvel Universe is simply not equipped to stop him. And looking at it honestly, they're not. The plan Doctor Strange eventually allows to succeed, letting Thanos win, letting him snap, betting everything on a 5-year window and a time heist. That plan works eventually, but at an almost incomprehensible cost. half of all life, 5 years of grief, an entire universe of people who lost someone, who lost themselves, who lost the version of reality they had built their lives inside. Now hold that image in your mind. Hold the full weight of what the Infinity War is, the scale of it, the seriousness of it, the billions of lives that hang in the balance of every decision made on every battlefield from Nohur to Wakanda. Hold all of that, and then introduce into this equation a 30-something-year-old man from City Z, Japan, who has a Class B Rank 7 hero certification, who pays careful attention to grocery store sales, who is running out of storage space for his video game consoles, and who has been trying for the last 3 years to feel something, anything, in the middle of a fight. Because every single opponent he has ever faced has died from a single punch, before the adrenaline even had time to reach his brain. Saitama does not come from a universe with infinity stones. He does not come from a universe with gods in the classical Marvel sense, no celestials shaping planets, no infinity gauntlet sitting in a vault somewhere, no cosmic hierarchy of beings measuring power levels and assigning rankings to reality itself. He comes from a universe where the power scale was already broken by one man before the story even started, a universe where monsters grow city-destroying. The Hero Association has a grading system for existential threats, and none of it, not one single bit of it, has ever made him feel like he was in a real fight. He is so far beyond the ceiling of his own universe's power scale that his universe has essentially run out of things to show him. He is bored in the way that only a person with infinite capability and zero challenge can be bored, not lazily, not contentedly, but with a specific, quiet, existential ache that comes from knowing that no matter what happens, it's already over before it starts. In this alternate universe, the mechanism by which Saitama crosses over is less important than the fact that he does. Perhaps it's a dimensional fracture caused by a battle in his own world. Perhaps one of the more reality-adjacent villains in his universe accidentally punches a hole between dimensions in the process of trying to kill him and failing. The exact how is not the point. The point is that Saitama steps through a tear in space, looks around at a universe that is demonstrably larger and more complex and more cosmically layered than the one he came from, and feels, for approximately 15 seconds, something close to curiosity. He is standing somewhere that doesn't look like Earth. The sky is wrong. The geometry of the stars is wrong. The air has a different weight to it. And somewhere in the distance, across the rubble of what used to be a functioning planet, there is the sound of a battle unlike anything his own universe ever produced, energy blasts that move like small suns, metal tearing through stone with a sound like the world cracking open, voices screaming in a dozen different languages, and underneath all of it, a low, resonant hum that Saitama cannot identify, but that his body, on some level below conscious thought, registers as significant. He adjusts his gloves. He looks around. He starts walking toward the noise, not because he has been told to, not because someone needs saving, not out of any great heroic motivation, but because it's the only interesting thing in his immediate field of vision, and interesting things in Saitama's life are rare enough that he doesn't walk away from them on principle. He doesn't know who Thanos is. He doesn't know what the Infinity Gauntlet does. He doesn't know that half the universe's life hangs on the outcome of what's happening a few kilometers ahead of him. He doesn't know that the people fighting and dying in that direction are doing so with the full weight of desperate, terrified heroism, knowing they are probably going to lose and fighting anyway because the alternative is to do nothing. He knows none of this. He is just a bald man in a cape walking toward a sound, in a universe that has no idea what just walked into it. And that right there, that precise moment of total ignorance walking toward total cosmic consequence, is where this story begins. The battle on Titan was not going well, and everyone who was still alive and conscious on that battlefield knew it, even if no one was saying it out loud, because saying it out loud would mean admitting that the plan, the very specific, very desperate, very improvisational plan that Tony Stark had assembled in approximately 45 minutes on a ship he had never flown before with people he had never met, was beginning to crack at the edges in ways that no amount of genius-level engineering or sorceress intervention could fully hold together. They had done everything right, or as close to right as the situation allowed. Strange had opened the portals. The Guardians had coordinated. Mantis had her hands on Thanos' head and was actively suppressing the most powerful being in the known universe, holding him in a state of suspended half-consciousness, while Spider-Man and Iron Man and Drax worked to pull the gauntlet from his hand. And for approximately 40 seconds, it had actually been working. For 40 seconds, the impossible had felt almost possible. And then Star-Lord found out about Gamora, and the plan collapsed the way only the very best plans collapse. Not from the outside, not because the enemy outmaneuvered them, but from the inside, from a single human moment of grief and rage that no tactical briefing could have accounted for, and no amount of preparation could have prevented. Because Peter Quill is not a soldier in the way that Rogers is a soldier. He is not a strategist in the way that Strange is a strategist. He is a man who loved someone and learned in the worst possible way that the person he loved was gone, and he reacted the way a person reacts, not the way a chess piece reacts. And that difference, that one deeply human difference, cost them everything. Thanos came back to full consciousness with the gauntlet still on his hand. Mantis was thrown. The others were scattered. Tony Stark took a wound from his own nanotech blade that should have been fatal, and was only survivable because of the sheer sophistication of the suit still managing to hold pressure on the injury. Strange stood at the center of what remained of the formation. And in that moment, that exact, crystalline, terrible moment, he reached into the future with the time stone and looked at the remaining outcomes. And the look on his face when he came back told everyone who was still watching that the number they were going to hear was not going to be a good one. 14,605 possible futures. One win. He had found the thread, the single, almost invisible thread, and he had begun to pull it toward himself. And everyone on that battlefield was now, without knowing it, inside the one timeline where things eventually work out, which means they were also inside the one timeline where things first get incomprehensibly, devastatingly worse before they get better. Strange knew this. He had accepted it. He was holding the whole shape of it in his mind the way you hold a very fragile object, carefully, with both hands, not squeezing, not adjusting, just holding, because the moment you try to change the shape of it, it breaks. What Strange had not seen, what the time stone had not shown him, what none of the 14 million timelines had contained, because it was an intrusion from outside the timeline structure entirely, was the figure that appeared at the far edge of the Titan battlefield, stepping through a shimmer in the air that closed behind him like a wound sealing shut, leaving no trace, no residue. No indication that a door between universes had just opened and closed in the middle of the most consequential battle in Marvel history. Strange saw him first, because Strange always sees things first, and because the Eye of Agamotto had registered something in that shimmer that his conscious mind hadn't processed yet. A signature that didn't match any known form of dimensional travel, didn't match the space stone's energy profile, didn't match mirror dimension fractures or quantum realm displacement, or any of the 100-odd methods of reality transit that he had cataloged in his years studying the mystic arts. It was something else entirely, something clean, almost accidental, like a footprint left by something that hadn't been trying to leave a mark. He turned, and he saw a man in a white cape and yellow boots picking his way across the rubble of Titan, with the mild, slightly distracted expression of someone who has arrived at a party they weren't invited to and is trying to figure out whether the food is any good. The man was not large by the standards of this battlefield. He was not armored. He was not radiating power in any visible spectrum. He did not have the bearing of a threat or the posture of a hero, or the energy of someone who understood the gravity of where they were standing. He looked, if Strange was being entirely honest with himself, like a man who had wandered in from somewhere considerably less important and had not yet been told that this was not the place for wandering. Tony Stark's suit registered him 0.3 seconds after Strange's eyes found him, and the readout that came back from the initial scan was the thing that made Tony go very quiet in a way that people who knew Tony Stark recognized as genuinely unsettling, because Tony Stark did not go quiet in the face of things he understood. He went loud and fast and precise. The quiet was reserved for the things that didn't make sense, the things that sat outside his models, the things that the data couldn't explain, and the data on this man could not be explained. The suit was scanning for energy output, for biological threat markers, for radiation signatures, for gravitational distortion, for every measurable indicator of danger that 3 years of post-Ultron suit development had built into the detection arrays, and what it was returning was, essentially, nothing. Not the nothing of a cloaking device, not the nothing of a scanning error. Just nothing. A man-shaped object that the most sophisticated personal detection system on Earth was looking directly at, and finding no reason to flag. "Strange," Tony said, and his voice had that particular flat quality that it got when he was recalibrating his entire understanding of a situation in real time. "Are you seeing this?" "I'm seeing it," Strange said, and he was already running the calculation, already trying to fit this new variable into the shape of the plan he was holding, already asking himself whether this was the thing, whether this was the element that hadn't appeared in any of the 14 million timelines because it had arrived from outside them entirely, whether the one path to victory that he had found ran through whatever this was. He didn't know. He genuinely didn't know, and for Stephen Strange, a man who had rebuilt his entire identity around the capacity to know things that other people couldn't access, not knowing was a sensation with real physical weight to it. Nebula, who had survived the initial collapse of the plan and was crouched behind a slab of fractured stone with a weapon she'd pulled from somewhere and eyes that missed nothing, looked at the figure picking through the rubble and said, with the economy of expression that came from a lifetime of emotional suppression, "That's not one of ours." Spider-Man, who was hanging from a piece of jutting architecture approximately 20 meters up, and trying very hard not to let the pain from 3 broken ribs affect his voice, said, "My spider sense isn't going off. Like at all. Which is, I don't know if that's good or bad, Mr. Stark, because usually when something that big shows up in a fight my spider sense is extremely loud about it." Tony said nothing to that, because he didn't have an answer, and he pointed one of his repulsors in the direction of the approaching figure more out of reflex than intention. The way you point a flashlight at something moving in the dark, not because you expect the flashlight to stop it, but because pointing something at an unknown quantity gives you the feeling of having a plan. Saitama stopped walking. He looked at the repulsor pointed at him. He looked at Tony Stark. He looked at the rest of the battlefield, the carnage, the scale of the destruction, the unconscious bodies, the energy residue still crackling across the stone, the distant shapes of a conflict that had clearly been happening at a level of intensity he hadn't fully appreciated from across the rubble field. He took all of it in with the calm, assessing look of a man who has seen worse in his morning commute, and then he looked back at Tony and said, in Japanese, something that none of the suit's translation software was quite fast enough to catch. But that Mantis, who was slowly recovering consciousness nearby, and whose empathic abilities extended to basic linguistic pattern recognition in extremis, later described as approximately equivalent to, so something is actually happening here. Strange lowered his hands from a defensive casting position. He had been building a sling ring construct since the moment he registered the figure's presence, a reflex so deeply trained that it happened below conscious decision-making, and he consciously dismantled it now, not because he had decided this person was safe, but because some instinct older and quieter than his tactical training was telling him that if this person wanted to be a threat, a sling ring construct would not be the thing that stopped it. And performing an aggressive magical gesture at something you don't understand is, In the vocabulary of the mystic arts, one of the worst things you can do. "Who are you?" Strange said in English, and then in Mandarin, and then in 3 other languages, cycling through the ones most likely to land with a stranger of unclear origin. Saitama scratched the back of his head. He looked at Strange with the expression of a man who is trying to decide if this conversation is going to be interesting or not. Then he looked past Strange, at the distant shape of Thanos, who was recovering from the disruption of the failed plan, and rising to his full height at the other end of the battlefield, the infinity gauntlet catching the light of Titan's fractured sky in a way that made the stones gleam with a cold, terrible beauty. And something shifted in Saitama's expression. Not alarm, not recognition, not fear, just the very faint, very quiet flicker of something that, on another face in another context, you might have called interest. He had been looking for an opponent for a very long time. He had crossed dimensions by accident and arrived in the middle of a war he knew nothing about, in a universe he had never seen, surrounded by people pointing weapons at him and asking questions in languages he didn't fully speak. And at the far end of this battlefield, there was a very large purple man in gold armor, who was radiating more raw power than anything Saitama had ever registered in the whole of his own universe's history. He pointed at Thanos. He looked at Strange. He asked, in the simple, direct way of a man who has already made up his mind and is only asking as a courtesy, whether that one over there was the problem. Strange stared at him for a long moment. Then, because the timeline he was protecting had no instructions for this moment, because none of the 14 million futures had prepared him for the question being asked in quite this way, by quite this person, he said the only honest thing he could say. "Yes," Strange said, "that's the problem." Saitama nodded. He cracked his knuckles. He started walking. Thanos had been hit before. That is an important thing to understand before you try to comprehend what happens next, because the narrative of Thanos as an unstoppable force is sometimes told in a way that erases the fact that he has taken damage, real damage, from real opponents, and absorbed it and continued. And that capacity to absorb punishment and continue was itself a form of power that went beyond the gauntlet, beyond the stones, beyond the army and the resources, and the centuries of accumulated tactical experience. Thor had driven Stormbreaker into his chest on Wakanda deep enough that by any biological standard the wound should have been immediately fatal, and Thanos had used the last of his conscious will to snap his fingers anyway, because the plan mattered more than the body, because the mission had become so thoroughly fused with his identity that the idea of dying before completing it was not something his mind was capable of fully processing as a real outcome. He had taken hits from the Hulk. He had taken energy blasts from multiple Infinity Stone users simultaneously during various points in his history across the comics and extended universe material. He had been at the center of conflicts that reshaped the physical geography of planets. He was not a being who was unfamiliar with the experience of being struck by something that intended to destroy him. None of that history prepared him for Saitama, not because Saitama was faster, though he was, not because Saitama was stronger in the way that strength is normally measured, as a quantity, a force per unitaria calculation that physics can describe and engineers can model and strategists can account for. But because what Saitama represented was something that the Marvel Universe, for all its cosmic scale and its reality-bending artifacts and its ancient beings who predated the current iteration of existence, had never actually produced. It had produced gods. It had produced beings of near-infinite power. It had produced entities like the Living Tribunal and the One Above All who existed at levels of abstraction so far above conventional conflict that the word power barely applied to them anymore. But it had never produced a human being, a person, a mortal origin creature who had started as something unremarkable and trained himself past every ceiling, who had broken the concept of limit so completely that the word limit had simply stopped applying to him in any measurable sense. Thanos saw him coming from a considerable distance, because Thanos missed very little, and the sight of a lone figure walking toward him across the rubble of Titan while everyone else on the battlefield was either unconscious, retreating, or frozen in the particular stillness of people who don't know what they're watching, that sight registered. He assessed. He calculated. His eyes, which had evaluated the threat level of every opponent he had ever faced with a speed and accuracy that bordered on supernatural, moved across Saitama's body and found nothing that his experience base could classify as dangerous. No armor, no visible weapon, no energy signature, no dimensional resonance, no cosmic enhancement, no godhood marker, no stone, no artifact, no enhancement of any recognizable category. A man. A small man, by the standards of this battlefield, in white and yellow, walking with the unhurried pace of someone on their way to check the mail. Thanos did not lower his guard, because Thanos never lowered his guard, but he also did not raise it in the specific way he raised it when something genuinely concerned him. And that miscalculation, that single, entirely reasonable, entirely understandable miscalculation based on a lifetime of accurate threat assessment, was the hinge on which everything that followed would turn. He let Saitama get close enough that the distance between them was the kind of distance where a normal conversation could happen at a normal volume, and in that proximity, for the first time, something in Thanos' assessment shifted slightly, not toward alarm exactly, but toward a recalibration. There was something about the way this person moved. Not the movement of a trained fighter, not the controlled economy of motion that Rogers had, or the fluid readiness that Natasha had, or even the purposeful aggression that the Hulk had. It was something else. A looseness. A complete and total absence of tension in the body, not the looseness of someone who is relaxed because they feel safe, but the looseness of someone who is relaxed because safety and danger have become, for them, the same category of experience. Someone for whom the distinction between a threatening situation and a non-threatening situation has collapsed entirely, because no situation has been threatening in a very long time. Thanos said something. The exact words don't matter. They were the words of a being who has decided that this small, unremarkable-looking creature needs to be removed from his path before he finishes what he came here to do, framed in the particular language of dismissal that Thanos used for things he considered beneath real engagement. He raised the gauntlet. He channeled the Power Stone first, because the Power Stone was the foundational stone, the one that amplified everything else, the one that turned a strike from a powerful being into a strike that could shatter continents, and he brought it down toward Saitama with the full, concentrated, stone-amplified force of the most physically powerful Titan in recorded history. The shockwave from the impact hit the Avengers across the battlefield like a wall of compressed air, throwing those who were still standing off their feet and sending new cracks racing across the already fractured surface of Titan. Strange caught himself on a sling ring platform he generated in the half-second before impact. Tony's suit braced automatically. Spider-Man's webline snapped, and he caught himself on the next surface by reflex. The sound of the impact was not like any sound a normal strike produces. It was a deep, resonant concussion that traveled through the ground as much as through the air, the kind of sound that the body hears in the chest before the ears process it. The dust settled. Thanos stood, and Saitama stood in front of him, in the exact same place he had been standing before the strike, with the exact same expression on his face, which was the expression of a man who has been tapped on the shoulder and turned around to find no one there. He looked down at his own chest, where the impact had landed. He looked back up at Thanos. He blinked once with the slow deliberateness of someone genuinely trying to determine whether something happened or not. Thanos stared at him, and for the first time in the Infinity War, for the first time in a very long time, Thanos did not immediately know what to do next. He did not panic. Thanos did not panic. But he escalated, because escalation was the logical response to an outcome that didn't fit the model, and he brought all 5 stones online simultaneously. Power, space, reality, soul, and time. the full devastating symphony of the Infinity Gauntlet operating at maximum capacity. The kind of output that had, in various configurations, unmade matter, rewritten reality, erased consciousness, manipulated causality, and restructured the fundamental nature of existence at the atomic and subatomic level. He directed all of it, every fragment of that incomprehensible output, at the man standing in front of him. What happened next lasted approximately 6 seconds, and the Avengers who witnessed it from across the battlefield would spend a long time afterward trying to find language for what they saw, and mostly failing, because the language for it didn't exist yet. The reality stone bent the space around Saitama into configurations that should have been incompatible with biological survival. The space stone attempted to compress him, to fold the coordinates of his physical location into a point so small that matter couldn't persist there. The time stone ran his personal timeline forward and backward simultaneously, which was a technique that had reduced far more resilient beings than a human to fundamental incoherence. The soul stone reached into him, looking for the thing that made him continuous, the thread of selfhood that, if severed, would unravel a person from the inside. The power stone simply hit him with everything, continuously, without interruption, a sustained output of force that was measurably enough to destroy a planet given sufficient time. Saitama stood in the middle of all of it. He raised one hand in front of his face, not as a defensive gesture, more the way you raise your hand in front of your face when someone is shining a very bright flashlight at you and you're trying to see past it. He looked mildly inconvenienced. The way you look mildly inconvenienced when you're trying to read something and someone keeps turning the lights off and on. The stones were working. That was the thing that's strange, watching from a distance with every sense he had extended toward the center of that maelstrom, confirmed to himself with absolute certainty. The stones were working. They were firing at full capacity. The reality stone was genuinely bending local space-time. The time stone was genuinely running temporal distortion on Saitama's physical presence. All of it was functioning exactly as it should. The issue was not that the stones were failing. The issue was that none of it was sufficient. The gap between what the Infinity Gauntlet could do at maximum output and what would be required to produce a meaningful effect on Saitama was not a small gap that more power might close. It was a categorical gap. A gap between two different kinds of thing entirely. Thanos understood this 4 seconds in. It took him 4 seconds, which was faster than almost anyone else in the universe would have processed that information, because most beings would have spent considerably longer in denial before the reality of it landed. 4 seconds. And then the reality of it landed, and Thanos, who had never felt this, not in the presence of Thor, not in the presence of the Hulk, not in the presence of any enemy he had ever faced, felt something cold move through him that he did not have a ready name for, and that he would not have been willing to name even if he had, because naming it would have made it real. Saitama lowered his hand. He looked at Thanos with the expression of a man who has just done a practice warm-up and found it less engaging than anticipated. He wasn't angry. He wasn't grim. He wasn't performing the focused intensity of a warrior about to deliver a killing blow, wasn't doing any of the things that the people watching him had learned to associate with the moment before a decisive strike. He just looked at Thanos the way he looked at everything, with a kind of patient, faintly melancholy openness, the look of a man who is hoping, one more time, that this is the one that finally makes him feel something. He pulled his fist back. Thanos, who had lived for thousands of years, who had conquered hundreds of worlds, who had looked into the eyes of gods and felt nothing but the steady certainty of his own purpose, had one thought in the half-second before impact. Not a tactical thought, not a calculation, not a plan. Just one thought, clean and simple and utterly out of character for a being of his nature, arriving in his consciousness the way a single drop of water arrives on a dry surface, immediate, complete, and impossible to take back. Oh! The punch landed, a single punch, no build-up, No power-up sequence. No dramatic declaration or battle cry or moment of gathering energy. Just a fist, moving at a speed that the gauntlet's reality warping could not bend around, carrying a force that the Power Stone's amplification had no framework to contextualize, connecting with the side of Thanos's jaw in a moment so brief and so complete that the Avengers watching from across the battlefield weren't entirely certain they had seen it happen until the aftermath began. The aftermath took a while to fully develop, but its beginning was immediate. Thanos, the Mad Titan, the most feared being in the known universe, the man who had just held 5 Infinity Stones at full capacity for 6 seconds without producing a visible effect on his opponent, left the surface of Titan. Not dramatically, not in a great arc of cinematic impact. He simply was there, and then he was not there, and the direction he had gone was up and away, through the fractured sky of Titan and beyond it, into the dark. The gauntlet hit the ground where he had been standing. The stones flickered once and went dark. The battlefield went completely silent. Every person still conscious on the surface of Titan, Strange, Tony, Peter, Nebula, Drax, Mantis, Star-Lord looked at the space where Thanos had been, and then at Saitama, who was standing in that space now, looking at his own fist with the expression of a man who has just tried a new brand of cereal and found it acceptable but not exceptional. He flexed his fingers. He looked at the gauntlet on the ground. He looked up at the sky, in the direction Thanos had gone. He sighed very quietly in the specific register of a sigh that contains within it the entire weight of someone who wanted, very badly, for this to have been a real fight. Tony Stark's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, filtered through the suit's speakers with a slight distortion that made it sound even more stunned than it already was. "What?" Tony said, and then stopped, because there was no natural completion to that sentence that would have been adequate. The hell? The silence on Titan lasted longer than silences usually last after a battle. Normally when a fight ends, when the last blow lands, when the last combatant falls, when the threat that has been driving everyone to the absolute edge of their physical and mental capacity suddenly ceases, there is a release, a collective exhale. The body's survival systems begin to stand down, the adrenaline starts to metabolize, and the silence that follows is not really silence at all but the sound of living things remembering that they are alive. That is what silence after a battle usually sounds like. It has warmth in it. It has relief in it, however complicated, however temporary. The silence on Titan after Saitama's punch did not have any of that. It was a different kind of silence entirely. The silence of people who have just watched something happen that their existing frameworks cannot process, and who are, each in their own way, staring at the gap where their understanding used to be and trying to figure out what goes there now. Tony Stark was still standing in his suit with one repulsor half raised, pointed at nothing, because his arm had not received the signal to lower yet, because the part of his brain that sends that signal was busy doing something else entirely. Peter Parker had come down from his elevated position and was standing on the surface of Titan for the first time since the fight started, and he was looking at the gauntlet on the ground and then at the sky, and then at Saitama, and then at the gauntlet again, cycling through these 3 points of reference, as if one of them was eventually going to offer an explanation. Nebula was the most still of all of them, which was saying something given that Nebula was rarely anything other than still. But this was a different quality of stillness. Not the controlled stillness of a tactician reading the battlefield, but the stillness of a being who has spent her entire life in proximity to the most powerful force she had ever encountered, who had organized her entire psychology around the towering, inescapable fact of her father's power, and who was now standing in a place where that power had been ended in a single second by a man who looked faintly disappointed about it. Strange was the first one to move with purpose. He walked to the gauntlet not quickly, not with the sharp urgency of someone securing a weapon, but with the deliberate pace of a man who needs to touch something to confirm it is real. He crouched beside it. He extended his senses into it the way a doctor extends their senses into a patient, carefully, feeling for what was there and what wasn't. The stones were present. All 6 of them, still seated in their places, still physically intact, still radiating the faint energetic signature that they always radiated because they were objects of fundamental cosmic power, and fundamental cosmic power does not simply switch off because its wielder has been removed. But something had changed in the quality of their presence. They felt, and Strange searched for the right word and kept arriving at the same one, which he found deeply unsettling. They felt shocked. Which was not a word that should apply to inanimate objects, even inanimate objects of infinite cosmic significance. And the fact that it was the most accurate word he had was telling him something about what Saitama's punch had done at a level below the physical. Tony walked up beside him. He looked down at the gauntlet. He said quietly, "Is it safe to touch?" Strange said, "Probably," and then after a pause, "I don't actually know." Tony absorbed this. "Right," he said. "Great, super helpful, thank you." Strange stood up. He looked at Saitama, who had picked up a small piece of rubble and was turning it over in his hands with the idle curiosity of someone waiting for a bus. And Strange said, in the calmest voice he could produce, which was calmer than most people could have managed under the circumstances, "We need to talk about who you are and where you came from, because right now you are the single most significant unknown variable in the history of the universe as I understand it. And I have a very good understanding of the universe." Saitama looked up from the piece of rubble. He said something in Japanese. Strange's linguistic abilities, which were considerable, were sufficient to catch the gist of it, which was approximately. The large purple one was supposed to be a challenge, and it wasn't, and he wanted to know if there were others. Strange stared at him for a long moment. "Others?" he repeated. "Yeah," Tony said, reading the expression on Strange's face with the accuracy of someone who had spent years learning to read that particular face in crisis situations. That's not a great question for him to be asking right now, is it? It was not a great question for him to be asking right now, because the answer was yes, there were others. The situation on Titan had been, for all its cosmic scale, only one front of a war that was happening simultaneously in multiple locations, and the part of the war that Saitama had just ended was the part that involved Thanos personally, which was not the same as the part of the war that involved Thanos' army, his children, his infrastructure of conquest that had been operating across the galaxy for decades, or the very specific and very immediate situation that was, at this moment, unfolding on Earth, where the Black Order was attacking Wakanda, and where every hero who hadn't made it to Titan was fighting and losing ground, and where Vision still had the Mind Stone embedded in his head, and where the one plan Strange had been protecting, the single thread through 14 million futures, was now something Strange was no longer certain applied, because the thread he had been following assumed a specific sequence of events. And that sequence had just been comprehensively disrupted by a fist from outside the timeline. Strange opened a portal to Earth. He didn't explain it to Saitama. He didn't have the language tools to explain it to Saitama, not quickly, not in the time available. He stepped through and looked at the battlefield in Wakanda, and what he saw confirmed what he had already suspected, which was that the fight there was still happening, that the army Thanos had sent was not an army that had a recall function built into it, that the Black Order was still operational, that Vision was still in danger, and that the absence of Thanos from the equation had not, in itself, stopped the machinery of destruction that Thanos had set in motion before he left. Tony came through the portal behind him, then Peter, then, with a look of profound uncertainty that Tony would later describe as the most relatable expression he had ever seen on an alien cyborg, Nebula. And then last, Saitama, who stepped through the portal with the same mild curiosity he had brought to every other transition point in this experience, looked around at the battlefield in Wakanda, the armies clashing, the Wakandan warriors and the Avengers holding the perimeter, Vision down and injured, Wanda fighting to protect him. The Black Order moving with the focused lethality of beings who had been doing this for a very long time, and tilted his head slightly to one side. The way you tilt your head when you've arrived somewhere, and found that there is more going on than the initial summary suggested. Rogers saw Saitama before anyone else on the Wakandan side did, because Rogers was the kind of person whose situational awareness in combat didn't degrade under pressure, and he registered the portal opening and the people coming through it, and processed the familiar ones, Strange, Stark, Parker, Nebula, and then got to the unfamiliar one, and held on it for a full second before the tactical part of his brain overrode the question-asking part, and he said, loudly, "To no one in particular, who is that?" Nobody had a good answer to that in the moment, so nobody gave one, and Rogers filed it under deal with later and went back to the immediate problem, which was Corvus Glaive moving through the left flank with a speed that the current defensive arrangement couldn't adequately address. It took approximately 90 seconds for the situation on the Wakandan battlefield to resolve, and it resolved the same way the situation on Titan had resolved, which is to say quickly, and without sufficient drama to satisfy anyone who was watching it happen, because Saitama walked through the perimeter of the battle, absorbed several strikes from members of the Black Order that should have removed him from the equation entirely, and then addressed each of them in turn with the same fundamental tool he had applied to Thanos, which was a punch, delivered once per target, and the target ceased to be a meaningful part of the conflict upon receipt of said punch. Proxima Midnight lasted longer than the others, not because she was more capable of withstanding it, but because she was fast enough to avoid the first two attempts, and for approximately 10 seconds she and Saitama engaged in what was, from a purely technical standpoint, the closest thing to a real exchange that he had experienced since arriving in this universe, which meant that it lasted 10 seconds instead of 2, which Saitama would later reflect on as the most enjoyable portion of his entire visit, which tells you everything you need to know about the gap between what this universe considered its elite threats and what Saitama experienced as an adequate challenge. When it was over, the Wakandan battlefield was quiet. The army, leaderless and with its command structure eliminated, fractured and retreated in the way that armies fracture and retreat when the central organizing force that gives them coherence is removed. Vision was still alive. The Mind Stone was still in his head. Wanda was alive. Thor, who had arrived from the direction of the tree line with Stormbreaker in his hand, and the look of a man ready to do what he had come here to do, arrived approximately 4 minutes after the last meaningful combat ended, which was not how he had intended his entrance to go, and stood at the edge of the battlefield with an expression of pure, unprocessed confusion that was, in a different context, almost funny. He looked at Rogers. "What happened?" he said. Rogers looked at Saitama, who was standing in the middle of the battlefield looking at his hands and then back at Thor. "I don't fully know yet," he said, "but we won." Thor looked at Saitama for a long time. As a god, as an Asgardian who had grown up in a cosmology that sorted beings by their power and their lineage and their place in the divine hierarchy, Thor had a sensitivity to the presence of power that went beyond what humans could typically perceive, a kind of deep, instinctive recognition that fired when he was in proximity to something that existed at a level that mattered. He had felt it around Odin. He had felt it around the Celestials, distantly, in the way you feel a large sound in the ground before you hear it in the air. He was feeling it now, standing 40 meters from a man in a yellow belt and rubber boots, and it was not like anything he had felt before, not in quality but in magnitude. Less like standing near a great power and more like standing near a great absence, a place where the concept of limitation had simply been removed from the equation entirely, leaving something that his divine instincts had no ready category for. "No," Thor said quietly, with a gravity that was not performative and not theatrical but simply the response of a being who understood, on a level most of his teammates couldn't access, what they were actually looking at. "We didn't win. We were helped. There is a very significant difference, and I think we need to understand it before we decide how we feel about what just happened. Nobody argued with that. And in the quiet that followed, with the battle over and the gauntlet sitting in a case that Strange had conjured, and the stones sealed and Thanos gone, and the Black Order eliminated and Vision alive, and the snap unsnapped because it had never happened in the first place. In all of that, in the middle of the best possible outcome anyone could have hoped for at the start of this day, there was a feeling that was growing among the people who had been on these battlefields and seen what they had seen. And the feeling was not relief, or not only relief, but something more complicated and considerably less comfortable than relief. Because the question that Thor had asked without quite asking it, the question underneath, "We were helped," was sitting in the air above all of them, unspoken but present and getting louder with every second that passed. If something could do that to Thanos, what happens if it ever decides to do it to them? The debrief happened in stages, the way all debriefs happen after events that are too large to process in a single sitting, and each stage revealed something new and something worse. Not in the way that new information is worse when it is simply more bad news of the same kind, but in the way that new information is worse when it reframes everything that came before it, and forces you to understand that what you thought was the problem was actually just the surface of the problem. And underneath the surface there is something considerably more structural and considerably more difficult to address. The first stage was medical. The second was tactical. The third was, for lack of a better word, philosophical. And it was the third stage that nobody was really prepared for, even the people who thought they were prepared for things. Nick Fury arrived on the Wakandan battlefield 6 hours after the fighting ended, which was faster than it sounds given the logistical realities of getting from wherever Fury was to wherever he needed to be. And he arrived with the expression he always arrived with, which was the expression of a man who has already read every available report, already formed 3 separate working theories, already identified the 17 ways the current situation could go badly, and is now here in person specifically because the reports are not answering the one question that matters most. He looked at the battlefield. He looked at the containment case with the gauntlet in it. He looked at the Avengers, who had the collective appearance of people who had fought a war and won it, and then immediately found out that winning it had created a different and possibly larger problem. He looked at Saitama, who was sitting on a piece of rubble approximately 30 meters away eating something he had found in a pocket of his suit, with the placid, self-contained energy of a man who is waiting for a train. Fury looked at Rogers. Rogers looked back at him. There was a long pause that contained within it an entire conversation conducted entirely through the specific vocabulary of 2 people who have known each other long enough that words are sometimes redundant. "Start from the beginning," Fury said. Rogers started from the beginning. It took a while. When he finished, Fury was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "And the scan results." Tony pulled up the data on a holoscreen that he projected from his rebuilt forearm unit, because the suit itself was still undergoing repair protocols after the Titan engagement. The scan results from every piece of equipment that had been pointed at Saitama since his arrival: Stark suit sensors, the Wakandan biometric arrays, the readings that Hill had pulled from the satellite networks during the Wakandan battle, the preliminary analysis that Banner had run using the equipment available at the facility, were displayed in a column of numbers and readouts and electromagnetic signatures. And the column told the same story that it had told every time anyone looked at it, which was essentially no story at all. No energy signature above baseline human, no biological enhancement markers, no radiation profile consistent with supersoldier serum, gamma exposure, cosmic enhancement, symbiotic bonding, mystic augmentation, or any other category of power source modification that the database contained. A human being by every available metric. A completely, unremarkably, almost insultingly ordinary human being. Fury looked at the readouts for a long time. "So what we're saying," he said slowly, is that we have no idea. Correct, Tony said. And what we saw him do. Also correct. Fury closed his eye briefly and opened it again. I hate this, he said, which was as close to an expression of vulnerability as Nick Fury was capable of producing in a professional context, and everyone present understood it as such. Strange had been quiet through most of the debrief, which was unusual enough that several people had noticed it, and what they had correctly interpreted as thinking was actually something more specific and more troubling than general contemplation. Since the moment on Titan when he had first registered the dimensional signature of Saitama's arrival, he had been running a parallel process, maintaining full presence in the external conversation, while simultaneously conducting an internal investigation using every tool available to him, everything the eye of Agamotto could show him, everything his training in the mystic arts gave him access to. Everything that his understanding of dimensional theory and timeline mechanics and the fundamental structure of causal reality could bring to bear on the question of what Saitama was, and what his presence in this universe meant at the level that actually mattered, which was not the tactical level but the structural level, the level at which the universe itself was organized. He had been putting off saying what he had found. Not because he wasn't certain he was certain, or as certain as the information available allowed him to be, but because saying it out loud would make it real in a way that thinking it had not. And he was, in this specific instance, engaging in the very human behavior of delaying the moment of irreversibility, of standing at the edge of a statement and not yet jumping off it, because once you say a thing in a room full of people who will act on it, you cannot unsay it. He said it. The timeline is gone, Strange said, and the room went quiet in a specific way. Not damaged, not altered, gone. The sequence of events that I identified as the path to victory, the one in 14 million, it was contingent on Thanos completing the snap. The whole structure of it, the time heist, the return, the final battle, the reversal, all of it was downstream of the snap happening. Without the snap, there is no 5-year gap. No Scott Lang coming out of the quantum realm, no time travel, no undusting, none of it. The mechanism that I identified as the winning path requires as its foundational premise that Thanos succeeds. And he didn't succeed. And the reason he didn't succeed is standing over there eating whatever that is. Wanda said very quietly, so the people who would have been saved, the ones who came back, they're still here. They were never dusted. Yes, Strange said. That's good, she said. Yes, Strange said again, and there was something in his voice that made the word feel like the first step in a longer sentence that hadn't arrived yet. A yes that was not disagreeing with her but was not fully agreeing either. A yes that was doing the work of holding space for something more complicated than the simple good or bad binary she had offered. Because here was the thing that Strange was working through, the thing that he was trying to find the cleanest way to articulate. The timeline he had identified had not simply been a path to winning. It had been a path to a specific kind of winning, a winning that was painful and costly and devastating in ways that left permanent scars on the people who survived it, but a winning that was also, in its structure, knowable, comprehensible. A narrative that the universe could tell about itself, a story with a shape, with causality running through it in the direction causality was supposed to run, with consequences that were proportionate to their causes and victories that were earned by the people who achieved them through suffering and sacrifice and choice. The timeline had been a story in which the heroes lost and then won, and the winning meant something because of the losing, and the cost was terrible, but it was a cost that could be understood and eventually, with enormous difficulty, processed and integrated and survived. What they had now was not a story. What they had now was a situation in which the entire conflict, the most consequential conflict in the history of the universe, a conflict that had been building across galaxies for decades, driven by the iron will of the most powerful individual being in the known cosmos, had been resolved in approximately 45 seconds by someone who hadn't known what was happening, hadn't been asked, hadn't been part of any plan, and who was currently more focused on the contents of his jacket pocket than on the cosmic significance of what he had done. The universe had not been saved. The universe had been interrupted, and those were not the same thing. Fury said, "So what you're telling me is that this man, this individual, is sitting over there, and there is nothing on this planet or off this planet that can stop him from doing anything he decides to do, and we have no leverage, no containment option, no threat that would register to him as a threat, and no way to send him back to wherever he came from." "That is an accurate summary," Strange said. "And he seems friendly," Fury said. "He seems indifferent," Strange said. "Which is different. Friendly implies investment. He doesn't appear to be invested in us as a concept. He helped because we were there and the problem was there, and solving it was the most available interesting thing. That's not the same as being on our side." Tony had been standing very still during this exchange, which for Tony was the behavioral equivalent of someone else packing frantically, and he said, without looking up from the data on his holoscreen, "The interesting part isn't what he does to us. The interesting part is what happens to everything else." He pulled up a broader projection, a map of the Marvel Universe, simplified, with the major power centers marked. If word gets out, and it will get out, because word always gets out, that there is something walking around in this universe that can do what he did to Thanos without effort, without preparation, without so much as raising his heart rate. Every single being in this universe who has been operating on the assumption that power has a ceiling, that the strongest thing that exists has been identified and can be planned around, is going to have to completely rebuild their understanding of reality. Thanos was the ceiling. Everyone knew where the ceiling was. It was terrifying, but it was a known ceiling. He just walked through it. And now there's no ceiling, and every entity in this universe from the Celestials down to every mid-level cosmic warlord who's been quietly not causing trouble because the balance of power kept them in check. All of them are going to feel that ceiling disappear, and some of them are going to react to its disappearance in ways we are not going to like. Thor, who had been sitting apart from the group with the particular solitude of someone processing something on a level that regular conversation couldn't reach, spoke without looking up. "In Asgardian cosmology," he said, "there is a concept very old, older than the written record, for the moment when something enters a system that the system was not built to contain. It does not have a clean translation into English. The closest approximation is something like the thing that the walls were not made for." He looked up. "Every civilization builds its walls to keep out the things it knows about, the things it has faced before, the things it can imagine." He paused. "He is not a thing that any wall in this universe was made for, and the walls know it. That is what concerns me, not what he does, what the universe does in response to what he is." The room was quiet again. Outside, through the windows of the facility, the sun was setting over Wakanda in colors that had nothing to do with anything that had happened today, and everything to do with the fact that the planet was still turning, still operating on its own schedule, indifferent to the conversations happening inside small rooms where people tried to understand things that might not be understandable. Strange walked to the window. He looked out at the sky. He said to no one in particular and to everyone at once, "He is bored. That is the most important thing I have told you today, and I want to make sure it doesn't get lost in everything else. He came here by accident. He solved our problem as a side effect of being in the vicinity of it, and he is bored. He has been bored for years. And a being of effectively infinite power who has run out of challenges in his own universe, and has now discovered that this universe also does not present a meaningful challenge. That being, regardless of his intentions, regardless of his personality, regardless of how pleasant he seems when he is sitting on a rock eating his lunch, that being is the most structurally dangerous thing in the history of this universe. Not because he wants to hurt anything, but because the universe will keep producing things that try to hurt him, and the gap between what those things can do and what he is will never close. And every time that gap expresses itself, The collateral consequences for everything around them will be enormous, and he will walk away from it feeling nothing, and the universe will be a little more broken than it was before. He turned back to the room. "The Infinity War is over," he said. "I know that sounds like good news. I'm telling you it isn't. Because the thing that ended it is still here, and we have no idea what comes next. And for the first time since I looked at 14 million futures, I genuinely cannot tell you how this ends." There is a question that nobody in that facility asked out loud, not because they hadn't thought of it. They had all thought of it, each of them arriving at it through a different route at a different moment during the debrief. But because asking it out loud felt like the kind of thing that, once done, changes the atmosphere of a room permanently and cannot be undone. The question was simple. The question was the kind of simple that sits on the other side of enormous complexity, the simplicity you arrive at after everything complicated has been stripped away, and what's left is the thing that was always at the center. The question was, what does Saitama want? Not tactically, not in the immediate sense of does he want to hurt us or help us or leave or stay, but in the deeper sense. In the sense of what does a being without limit, without challenge, without the possibility of genuine defeat, actually want from existence, and what happens to a universe that cannot give it to him? Saitama, for his part, was not thinking about any of this. He was thinking about the fact that he was hungry, that the thing he had found in his pocket earlier had not been sufficient, and that this universe, whatever else it was, probably had convenience stores somewhere, and he was wondering how far away the nearest one was and whether they carried the right brand of instant noodles. This was not a performance of indifference. It was not a strategic posture or a psychological defense mechanism or a cultivated detachment in the tradition of warrior philosophy. It was simply the interior life of a man for whom the most recent 45 minutes, which from the outside had looked like the salvation of the universe, had registered internally as a moderately interesting interruption of an otherwise unremarkable afternoon. This is the thing that took Strange the longest to fully integrate, and that he would spend considerable time afterward trying to articulate to the others in ways that made the weight of it land correctly. The danger was not Saitama's power. The danger was the relationship between Saitama's power and Saitama's experience of it. Because power in the Marvel Universe had always been accompanied by something, by ambition, in Thanos' case, by grief and duty in Thor's case, by guilt and responsibility in Tony's case, by purpose, by drive, by some organizing emotional or ideological structure that gave the power direction, and therefore made it, in a fundamental sense, legible. You could understand a powerful being if you understood what they wanted. You could predict them, negotiate with them, oppose them, ally with them, because the power was always in service of something, and the something gave you a handle on the power. Saitama's power was not in service of anything. It was not restrained by anything. It was not shaped by ambition or ideology or love or fear or purpose. It simply was, the way a natural force simply is, not malevolent, not benevolent, not directed, not undirected, just present, in whatever situation it happened to find itself in, responding to immediate stimuli without a larger organizing structure giving those responses meaning. He had punched Thanos not because he had a position on the nature of justice or the value of life or the cosmological stakes of the Infinity War. He had punched Thanos because Thanos was the biggest thing available to punch, and he was in the vicinity. And Dr. Strange had said yes, that's the problem, and so he had addressed the problem the only way he knew how to address problems. He would have done the same thing to the Avengers if one of them had been the one standing at the end of the battlefield when he arrived. Not out of malice, out of the same mild, bored, reflexive problem-solving orientation that had defined his entire hero career. The Celestials felt his arrival before the debrief was finished. This is not a metaphor. The Celestials, those ancient, building-sized beings who seeded planets and shaped civilizations, and operated on timescales that made the Infinity War look like a minor incident, registered the presence of something in the universe that did not fit their models the way a vast, sensitive instrument registers an anomaly in the data, not with alarm exactly, but with the particular quality of attention that very old and very powerful beings pay to things that are new. They had been the architects of the Marvel Universe's power structure for longer than most civilizations had existed, and they knew that structure the way a builder knows a building. Every load-bearing wall, every stress point, every place where the design was strong and every place where it was, by necessity, a compromise. Saitama was not a stress point. He was not a crack in the wall. He was something outside the building entirely, something that the building's design had never accounted for. And the Celestials, confronted with this for the first time in their vast history, did what very old beings do when confronted with something genuinely outside their experience. They became very still and they watched, and they did not yet act, because acting requires a model for what you're acting toward, and they did not have one yet. The living tribunal, which was not a being in the conventional sense, but the closest thing the Marvel Universe had to a fundamental corrective principle, a cosmic immune system that activated when the balance of reality was sufficiently disrupted. The living tribunal stirred in the way that deep structural things stir when something touches them, and what it was registering was not a violation of any specific law but something more fundamental than law, a category error. A thing that was in the universe but not of it, not subject to its organizing principles, not contained within the hierarchy that the tribunal existed to balance and protect. The tribunal's function was to adjudicate between cosmic powers, to weigh them against each other, to maintain the balance. But you cannot adjudicate something that is not on the scale. You cannot weigh something that does not register as weight. The tribunal had no jurisdiction over Saitama, not because Saitama was above the tribunal, but because the framework within which the concept of jurisdiction had meaning did not extend to what Saitama was. This was, Strange would later write in a document that he kept encrypted in a location that he shared with no one, the actual catastrophe, not the power, not even the boredom, but the jurisdictional void. Every other being of significant power in the Marvel Universe existed within a web of constraints, laws, treaties, balances, the simple physics of consequence. That meant their actions had accountability built into them. Even Thanos, for all his monstrous capability, existed within the jurisdiction of those constraints. He could be tried. He could be stopped. He could be undone. There was a framework within which his actions had meaning, and within which the response to his actions had meaning. Saitama existed outside that framework entirely, not because he had broken through it like Thanos attempted to break through it, but because he had arrived from a place where the framework had never existed, and the framework had no mechanism for reaching him. He was not above the law of the Marvel Universe. He was simply not under it, and the law of the Marvel Universe had no procedure for that. The night after the debrief, Saitama sat outside the facility alone, looking up at a sky full of stars that were arranged differently than the stars of his own world, and he was doing what he often did when the world around him was quiet, which was thinking about nothing in particular and feeling, in a mild and diffuse way, the particular loneliness that comes from being something that cannot be met by anything in its environment. He was not unhappy. He had long since made a kind of peace with the thing that he was, or if not a peace exactly then a functional accommodation. The acceptance that this was how things were, that the world was the world and he was in it, and that some days were more interesting than others and most days were not very interesting at all, and that this was simply the nature of his existence, and there was no use organizing a significant emotional response around it. He had punched a very powerful purple man. He had then punched several other beings who seemed to be associates of the purple man. The people on the battlefield had been relieved, and some of them had tried to talk to him, and the conversations had been pleasant enough in the limited way that conversations are pleasant when neither party fully speaks the other's language, and neither party has quite enough context to understand what the other is actually saying. He did not know that the most powerful minds in this universe were, at this moment, sitting in a room inside the building behind him trying to figure out what to do about his existence. He would not have been offended by this if he had known. He probably would have found it mildly interesting, in the same way he found most things mildly interesting for approximately 30 seconds before the interest faded. What he did know, what he felt, sitting under the alien stars of the Marvel Universe with the quiet that follows a battle and the mild, familiar ache of a day that had not given him what he had, somewhere below conscious articulation, been hopping for, was that this universe was, in the final accounting, the same as his own universe. Bigger, more complex, more cosmically layered, with gods and stones and ancient beings and wars fought across the fabric of existence itself. But the same at the level that actually mattered to him, which was the level of challenge, of genuine opposition, of finding something in front of him that required the full weight of what he was, something that would push back in a way that made the pushing mean something. He had crossed dimensions by accident and found the most powerful being in the known universe and ended him in a single punch and felt, in the moment of impact, the exact same feeling he always felt in the moment of impact, which was nothing. A slight concussive pressure at the end of his arm, a brief burst of displaced air, and then the quiet and the slight disappointment and the familiar, terrible, unkillable question underneath all of it. Is that all? That is the darkest truth of this story. Not that Saitama is dangerous, not that the universe is broken, not that the Avengers are helpless or that the cosmic hierarchy is destabilized or that the living tribunal has no jurisdiction. All of those things are true, and all of them matter, but none of them is the thing that sits at the absolute center of what this alternate universe reveals when you look at it long enough and honestly enough. The darkest truth is that Saitama saved the universe. He saved it completely, efficiently, and without cost. He did what the Avengers could not do, what Doctor Strange's 14 million futures required years of pain and sacrifice to achieve. He did it in 45 seconds without breaking a sweat. Every life that would have been lost in the snap, preserved. Every person who would have spent 5 years in grief and confusion and the specific horror of a world that has been halved, spared that experience entirely. By every conventional metric of outcome, what Saitama did was the best possible result. Better than the one Strange had found. Better than the one they had all been moving toward at such enormous cost. And he will never feel it. He will never feel the weight of what he saved, because feeling weight requires the capacity to be crushed by it, and nothing can crush him. He will never feel the gratitude, because gratitude is not something his experience can metabolize into anything meaningful. He will never feel the victory, because victory requires the possibility of defeat, and defeat is not a thing that exists within the vocabulary of his existence. He saved half the universe, and it meant to him exactly as much as a Tuesday afternoon. And somewhere in that gap, the gap between what he did and what he can feel about what he did, there is something that is not quite tragedy and not quite horror but lives in the neighborhood of both. The quiet, permanent, unresolvable loneliness of a being for whom the universe has run out of things to offer. Thanos wanted to save the universe in his way and felt everything, every conviction, every grief, every terrible certainty. Saitama saved the universe in his way and felt nothing. And the universe, which was built on the assumption that power comes with feeling, that strength comes with stakes, that the ability to change everything means something to the being who changes it, the universe does not know what to do with that. It does not have a place for it. It does not have a story that fits around it. It saved, but it was not the story of a salvation. It was the story of an interruption, by something that passed through on its way to somewhere else, looking for a fight that this universe, for all its cosmic scale, could not give it. Saitama looked up at the stars a little longer. Then he went inside to see if anyone had food. And somewhere across the universe, in the silence left by a war that had ended before it understood itself, reality did what reality always does when confronted with something it cannot process. It continued, quietly, carefully. with the particular alertness of a system that knows, without being able to say exactly how it knows, that the most significant thing that has ever happened to it has just happened, and that the consequences are only beginning, and that the man at the center of it all is hungry and bored, and looking for something that may not exist in any universe he will ever find himself in. The Infinity War is over. The question that replaces it has no answer. And that is the most terrifying thing of all.